United States, 1994. It began with a knock at the door. On the evening of September 24th, 1994, 16-year-old Lisa Renee was alone in her family's apartment in Arlington, Texas. Her sister, Perline, and brother, Andrew, had gone out for the evening. Lisa stayed behind, doing homework and talking on the phone with a friend. Around 8:30 p.m., she told a friend someone was knocking. She sounded uneasy. Moments later, the line went silent. When her siblings returned around 11:30, the apartment was empty. The front door stood open. Lisa's books were scattered on the floor, her phone dangling from the cord. Outside, neighbors had seen a dark car idling nearby, then speeding off. Lisa Renee had vanished. She was born in St. Croix, part of the U.S. Virgin Islands, and had moved to Texas with her family only a few years earlier. She was quiet, soft-spoken, with a gentle sense of humor and good grades. Her disappearance didn't fit any familiar pattern. No troubled background, no reason to run away. By morning, the Arlington Police Department had opened a full missing person investigation. The FBI joined quickly. What emerged over the following days was a story of mistaken revenge and deliberate cruelty. 5 men, Orlando Hall, Bruce Webster, Demetrius Hall, Stephen Beckley, and Marvin Holloway, were at the center of it. They were drug traffickers operating out of Pine Bluff, Arkansas. A few days earlier, they had been robbed during a marijuana deal. They believed the culprits were Lisa's brothers. They weren't, but the men drove to Arlington anyway, planning to find the Renee brothers and force them to return the money. When they couldn't locate them, they decided to target Lisa instead. Phone records and witness statements later pieced together the timeline. Around 8:30 p.m., the men knocked on the door of the family's apartment, pretending to be police. Lisa, frightened, called her friend. She said there were men outside claiming to have a warrant. The friend told her not to open the door. She didn't, but the men broke in. Neighbors heard screams. A young woman's voice shouting, "Help me! Help me!" One neighbor looked out and saw her being forced into a car, a green Chevrolet Caprice. The vehicle drove north. Over the next 12 hours, Lisa was transported from Texas to Arkansas. The men stopped along the way, switching drivers, buying gas, and discussing what to do with her. At one stop near Benton, Arkansas, they took her into a motel room. Witnesses later testified that she was crying and begging to go home. They assaulted her repeatedly through the night. In the early morning hours of September 25th, they drove her to Bird Lake Park, a wooded area near Pine Bluff. They dragged her out of the car, still alive, and led her into the forest. She was beaten and raped again. Then they dug a shallow grave among the pines. One of the men hit her over the head with a shovel until she stopped moving. They covered her body with dirt and branches. By the time investigators found her remains a week later, the air had turned cool and damp. The forest floor was dark with early autumn decay. Her body was identified through dental records. The case moved swiftly through the courts. Each man was tried separately. Orlando Hall, described by prosecutors as the ringleader, was sentenced to death in 1995. Bruce Webster received a death sentence as well, though was later vacated due to intellectual disability. The others received life sentences. Hall's execution was delayed for 25 years. He spent those decades on federal death row, appealing his conviction and filing for clemency. None were granted. On November 19, 2020, he was executed by lethal injection at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. Witnesses said he remained calm as he was led into the chamber. When asked for final words, he apologized to Lisa's family and said he took full responsibility. The injection began at 11:47 p.m. He was pronounced dead 15 minutes later. Back in Arlington, the Renee family had long since left the apartment where it happened. The building still stands, an ordinary block of beige and brick, identical to dozens like it in the city's quiet neighborhoods. There is no plaque or marker, nothing to show where the knock came or how long she hesitated before answering the door. Just a narrow concrete walkway, and behind it, the small window that looked out onto the parking lot, where the green Caprice waited with its engine running. United States, 1997. On the night of May 13th, 1997, in the small town of Midwest City, Oklahoma, 8-year-old Kirsten Hatfield went to sleep in her bedroom just off the main hallway of her family's modest single-story home. The air outside was humid, the kind that pressed lightly against the windows. Her mother tucked her in around 9, turned off the light, and closed the door. By morning, Kirsten was gone. Her mother, Shannon, discovered the empty bed at 6 a.m. The sheets were tangled, the window blinds askew. The screen had been sliced open, and the window itself was cracked just wide enough for a small person to climb through. Outside, in the narrow strip of grass between the house and the fence, investigators later found a pair of underpants caught in the wood slats and a faint smear of blood on the sill. The police arrived within minutes. They sealed the block, combed the neighborhood, and began knocking on doors. Midwest City was quiet, a grid of low-roofed houses, trimmed lawns, and aging trees. By noon, every television in Oklahoma carried the same headline: "Local girl missing." Shannon told detectives she had last seen her daughter asleep in her bed. There was no sound in the night, no broken glass, no barking dogs. Kirsten's sister, who slept in the next room, heard nothing either. The house was old but tidy, the kind of place where every sound carried. Whoever entered that room had done it silently. Over the following days, volunteers gathered in the local church parking lot with flashlights and thermoses. Police used helicopters, bloodhounds, and mounted officers to search the nearby fields and creek beds. They found nothing. Then, about a block away, they found a small blood stain on the fence line of a neighboring yard. The blood matched Kirsten's type, but beyond that, the trail vanished. The investigation stalled. Rumors spread through the town. Parents began keeping their children indoors after dark. Every unfamiliar car drew suspicion. The window of Kirsten's room was replaced, the blinds straightened, but the house never felt the same. Shannon eventually moved away. For almost 20 years, the case remained unsolved. Detectives revisited it occasionally, reviewing the original files, the few pieces of physical evidence preserved in brown envelopes, the blood sample, the window screen, the clothing. In 2015, a new forensic team re-examined the items using modern DNA testing. They found something that hadn't been detectable in the 1990s, a male DNA profile. It came from the bloodstain outside Kirsten's window. When run through the national database, it matched a local man, Anthony Palma. Palma had lived just 2 houses down from the Hatfields at the time of the abduction. He had even joined the neighborhood search party in 1997. His name had appeared in the early case files, but only briefly. Investigators had questioned nearly everyone within a 2-block radius back then. Palma had cooperated, offered his alibi, and passed a polygraph. There had been nothing to hold him on. Now, 2 decades later, his DNA placed him at the window. Police arrested him at his home in October 2015. Inside, they found boxes stacked neatly along the walls, each labeled in his handwriting. He was quiet, polite, middle-aged, employed at a nearby auto shop. When asked about Kirsten, he said he didn't remember much about that time. He denied knowing her. The prosecution argued that Palma abducted Kirsten through her window in the middle of the night, assaulted her, and killed her soon after. They believed he buried her body somewhere near the neighborhood, though a thorough excavation of his property revealed no remains. In 2017, after a short trial, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Kirsten's body was never found. 2 years later, in January 2019, guards at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary found Palma dead in his cell, beaten and strangled by another inmate. He was 60 years old. The news was brief, a few lines in the local press. The case that had haunted Midwest City for decades was closed, at least officially. But the absence remained. The Hatfield house was eventually sold, repainted, and remodeled. The bedroom window, the one that opened out toward the narrow strip of grass, still faces the same wooden fence. The distance between the two is less than 3 feet. On certain nights, when the air is still and the neighborhood quiet, the faint sound of trains can be heard from the old railway line beyond the highway. The same sound that filled the night when Kirsten Hatfield disappeared. and the house stood silent with its window open to the dark. New York City, 1836. The city was a storm of movement. Cobbled streets slick with rain, gas lamps hissing, and carriages rattling through the dark. Downtown, near Thomas Street, stood a narrow, brick-fronted boarding house run by Rosina Townsend. It was respectable on the surface, but known quietly as a brothel. Among its residents was a young woman named Helen Jewett. She was 22, beautiful, well-spoken, and unlike most women in her trade. Her real name was Dorcas Doyen. She had been born in Maine, orphaned early, and taken in by a wealthy family who educated her. But by her late teens, she had fallen out with them, fled, and begun using her new name. In New York, she became one of the city's most sought-after courtesans, known for her intelligence, her letters, and her clientele, which included politicians, merchants, and clerks. On the night of April 9th, 1836, Helen retired to her upstairs room with a client she called Mr. Frank Rivers. His real name was Richard P. Robinson, a 19-year-old clerk at a dry goods store. He had been visiting her for months. The other women in the house saw him arrive around 10 p.m., wearing a long cloak and carrying a small lantern. An hour later, the house was silent except for the rain tapping on the shutters. Then, sometime after midnight, the stillness broke, the sound of a door opening, a sudden thud, and the faint crackle of fire. Rosina Townsend, half asleep, smelled smoke. She rushed upstairs and saw flames flickering under the door to Helen's room. She shouted for help. When she forced the door open, she found Helen's body on the bed, her head split by a hatchet wound, her nightdress burned, and the sheets smoldering. The fire hadn't yet spread far. The air was thick with the smell of lamp oil. In the corner lay a heavy, bloodied axe. Helen was dead. The other women screamed for the watchman. They searched the corridors and alley, but found no one. In the backyard, they discovered fresh footprints leading toward the fence. One set of boots, deep in the mud, the pattern distinctive. Within an hour, the police brought in a suspect, Richard Robinson. He was found at his boarding house a few blocks away, lying in bed, fully dressed, pretending to be asleep. His boots were wet. On the floor beside him was a cloak, its hem stained with what looked like soot and blood. When questioned, Robinson claimed he hadn't left his room that night. He said he had been playing cards with friends until midnight, then gone home. His friends, when interviewed, gave conflicting times. The police searched his belongings. In his trunk, they found letters from Helen, affectionate, detailed, some addressed to my beloved Frank. By dawn, crowds had gathered outside the brothel. Word spread quickly. Newspapers printed extras with lurid headlines. The story was scandalous. A murdered courtesan, a handsome young clerk, a bloody hatchet, and whispers of high society involvement. At the coroner's inquest, witnesses testified that Robinson had been Helen's frequent visitor. One of the other women said she had heard his voice that night through the thin walls. Another said she'd seen a man in a dark cloak leaving through the back garden moments before the fire. The trial began in June at City Hall. It was one of the first American murder cases to receive massive press coverage. Reporters filled the gallery. Pamphlets sold in the streets described Helen as both victim and temptress. Some papers romanticized her, calling her the beautiful murdered girl. Others called her fallen, suggesting her death was the price of her life. Robinson sat calmly through the proceedings, his expression blank. He was defended by a team of skilled lawyers who argued that the evidence was circumstantial. No one had seen him strike the blow, and the footprints in the yard could not be proven his. The blood on his cloak, they said, was candle wax. When Helen's letters were read aloud, the courtroom shifted uneasily. They were articulate and intimate, showing not a degraded woman, but one with wit, loneliness, and longing. The words gave her a presence, even in death. Still, after days of testimony, the defense painted her as unreliable, a prostitute, a liar, a manipulator. The jurors were all men. On April 10th, 1836, the verdict came quickly, not guilty. Outside, crowds shouted in anger. Reporters wrote that the jury had been swayed not by evidence, but by class and gender. The word of a wealthy clerk against that of a dead woman with no social standing. Robinson walked free. No one else was ever charged. He left New York soon after, reportedly moving to Texas under a new name. Helen's body was buried in the First Street Cemetery, her coffin simple and unmarked. In the weeks that followed, the case lingered like smoke. Letters appeared in newspapers signed, "A friend of Helen Jewett," defending her name. Writers and reformers began to question the way the justice system treated women, especially those whose reputations made them disposable. But the attention faded. The brothel on Thomas Street changed owners, then burned down years later. The spot where Helen's room once stood is now part of a warehouse district. At night, when the street's empty and the wind shifts, the gas lamps flicker against the old brick walls, the same color they were that April, when the room upstairs filled briefly with firelight, and the rain outside kept falling against the panes. Bolton, Lancashire, August 18, 1944. The air was warm and close, carrying the dull hum of wartime industry. On the narrow street of Davenport Street, rows of identical brick houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their small gardens trimmed, their windows dimmed under blackout curtains. At around 4 p.m., 6-year-old Sheila Fox left her school, St. James's, wearing a dark green dress and carrying a little satchel. She waved goodbye to her friends and began the short walk home. It should have taken no more than 10 minutes. She never arrived. Neighbors saw her once more that afternoon. A classmate later told police she saw Sheila talking to a man near the corner of Newport Street. He was tall, wearing a brown suit and a hat. The child had assumed he was her father. The two walked away together. That was the last confirmed sighting of Sheila Fox. Her parents, Robert and Mary Fox, realized something was wrong by early evening. Dinner time came and went. The street outside was quiet except for the sound of passing carts and the occasional distant drone of aircraft. Robert walked the route between their house and the school several times, calling her name. By nightfall, the local constabulary had been alerted. Officers went door to door, lanterns in hand. They searched sheds, bomb shelters, and allotments. No one had seen her. The following morning, word spread quickly through Bolton. Dozens of townspeople joined the search. They combed the canal banks, railway sidings, and the open fields beyond the town. Trains were stopped and checked. Police questioned known offenders and drifters. Nothing. There were no clues, no clothing, no footprints, no witnesses beyond the one child who'd seen her walking with the man. The country was in the final year of the war. Thousands of men were away fighting, and strangers passed through towns constantly. Soldiers on leave, laborers, evacuees. The disappearance of a little girl barely made national news. The home front was full of rationing, air raids, and quiet grief. Still, in Bolton, the case consumed the neighborhood. Parents began walking their children to and from school. The local paper printed Sheila's photo, short dark hair, round face, a slight, serious expression. Beneath it, a simple line, "Have you seen this child?" Leads came and went. A few claimed to have seen her boarding a bus. Others said she had been spotted near the market. Each was checked. None held up. Weeks passed, then months. By winter, the posters had begun to fade in the rain. The file remained open for years. Detectives would revisit it periodically, especially when similar cases appeared elsewhere in the country. Missing children, unknown remains. But Sheila's trail never reappeared. Her parents stayed in the same house on Davenport Street until the 1960s. They never moved, never changed their telephone number, in case she came home. Both died without knowing what had happened to her. Decades later, in 2001, the case resurfaced unexpectedly. A man renovating a house on the same street reported that years earlier, in the 1950s, he had seen another man digging in the garden late at night. He'd been a child at the time and thought little of it. But now, as the property was being rebuilt, he wondered if there had been a connection. Police returned to Davenport Street with ground-penetrating radar and excavation equipment. They dug carefully beneath the garden's soil, layer by layer. The air smelled of damp earth and clay. Nothing was found. The name Sheila Fox remains on the missing persons list, one of Britain's oldest unsolved child disappearances. There are no official suspects, no surviving witnesses, and no body. Today, Davenport Street looks much as it did then. The same narrow terrace of red brick houses, the same small pavements, the same stretch of sky between them. In the late afternoon, when school lets out, children still walk the same route home. The distance between the school gate and Sheila's front door is less than half a mile. At the corner where the last sighting was reported, the road bends slightly before it disappears between the houses. A quiet, unremarkable bend where the sunlight falls unevenly and the sound of footsteps fades quickly into the hum of the town. April 17, 1984. London was restless that morning. The streets around St. James's Square choked with shouts, chants, and the rising tension of an international standoff. Two groups had gathered outside the Libyan People's Bureau, one of them anti-Gaddafi demonstrators waving green and black flags, the other a small contingent of loyalists shouting back through the windows of the embassy. In the middle stood a cordon of Metropolitan Police officers keeping the crowds apart. Among them was WPC Yvonne Fletcher, a 25-year-old constable in her dark uniform, cap straight, radio clipped to her shoulder. She had joined the force at 19, one of the youngest women to make it through Hendon's training program, and was known among her colleagues for her composure. At 10:18 a.m., the air changed. A crack rang out across the square, then another. For a fraction of a second, the crowd froze, confusion before panic. People ducked behind cars. Officers drew their truncheons. Yvonne stumbled. She fell forward onto the pavement, clutching her side. Blood spread across her tunic. She whispered something, a half-formed word, before collapsing completely. Colleagues dragged her to cover, shouting for medics. Behind them, glass shattered on the upper floor of the Libyan embassy. The shots had come from inside. Paramedics fought to keep her alive as she was rushed to Westminster Hospital. She was pronounced dead within the hour. The bullet had torn through her liver and lung before lodging near her spine. Within minutes, the square was locked down. Armed units surrounded the building. No one was allowed in or out. Inside, diplomatic immunity shielded the occupants. 11 Libyans were trapped inside as negotiators and politicians debated how to handle it. The standoff lasted 11 days. Finally, after an agreement was reached, the Libyan diplomats were escorted to Heathrow Airport and flown back to Tripoli. None were charged. The building was searched, forensic teams scouring every inch, but the weapon was never found. Yvonne Fletcher's funeral drew thousands. Officers lined the streets as her coffin passed by, draped in a Union Jack. Television cameras captured the silent salute, the rain falling over the crowd. The murder shocked Britain. It was the first killing of a policewoman on duty in modern British history, and it happened under the eyes of the public, broadcast across the world. In the months that followed, relations between the United Kingdom and Libya collapsed entirely. The Libyan embassy was shut down, and diplomatic ties were severed. It would take 15 years before they were restored. The case remained open, technically unsolved. The men inside the embassy were known, their names recorded, their movements documented, but political protection made prosecution impossible. Over the decades, new evidence surfaced. Ballistic traces, audio recordings, witness statements, enough to narrow the suspected gunman to one man. He was never extradited. Yvonne's colleagues never stopped pushing for answers. In 2015, officers returned once more to Libya, pursuing cooperation with the new government. It led nowhere. Her name endures in London's police history, carved into the memorial at St. James's Square, a few meters from where she fell. The paving stones there still bear faint discolorations from the day, faint marks that no amount of rain or time have completely erased. Visitors who pause in the square sometimes report the same small, strange detail. The quiet there feels different, amid the noise of traffic in the city's hum. The corner where she stood is oddly still, as if the air itself remembers the moment the shouting stopped and the first bullet cracked through the morning. Sydney, Australia, September 8, 1988. A warm spring evening. A station car park emptying beneath sodium lamps, and the ordinary sound of tires on gravel. Janine Balding parked her little sedan, locked the door, and began walking toward the station. She was 20, a bank clerk from Wagga Wagga, due to be married the following year. She never reached the platform. The overflow dirt lot on the opposite side of the railway line at Sutherland was the place where she was taken. A group of 5 people, 4 youths and 1 adult, had been drinking and sleeping rough around the city earlier that day. One of them later told police the idea came up to get a Sheila and rape her. They picked Janine at random as she crossed the lot. Witnesses who saw the men moving about later said they seemed aimless. An earlier approach to another woman had been rebuffed, and that woman drove away, frightened. Janine did not get away. Her car was found abandoned. Inside lay her handbag, some papers, the ordinary small things a person would leave in haste. The keys were gone. The lines of the investigation followed the path of a short, violent journey. Forced into a vehicle, driven across parts of Sydney, assaulted at knife point, and carried at last into a paddock at Minchinbury, west of the city. There, on a property beside a dam, she was gagged with a bandana, restrained with rope, and held down until she could no longer breathe. Her body was later recovered from the water. Police identified 5 people connected with the abduction: Stephen Wayne Shorty Jameson, Matthew James Elliott, Bronson Matthew Blessington, Wayne Lindsay Wilmot, and Carolyn Arrow. Their ages ranged from early teens to early 20s. Some were legally children at the time. The raw facts recorded in the brief reports are terse. Abduction in a car park, multiple perpetrators, sexual assault, drowning in a dam. The forensic work at the time was laborious and limited by the technology of the day. Swabs, fibers, and a bandana used to gag Janine were preserved. Witness statements were taken from the victim's friends and from people who had seen strangers in the car park that evening. One passerby remembered a lumpen, unkempt group around a car. Another recalled a woman looking frightened and then being led away. The descriptions were partial and inconsistent. The darkness and the shock of the scene blurred details. Over the weeks that followed, detectives pieced together a sequence from fragments. The men's movements, receipts from service stations, the route taken to the Minchinbury paddock, and the final place where her body lay. Trials followed. In 1990, Jameson, Elliott, and Blessington were convicted of abduction, rape, and murder in the New South Wales Supreme Court. Life sentences were imposed, and the judge recommended they never be released. The other 2, Wilmot and Arrow, were found to have taken part in the abduction, though their roles were characterized differently in court. Forensic exhibits, witness testimony, and confessions comprised the prosecution's case. For years, the convictions stood, and the sentences were among the heaviest meted out in the state for crimes by youths. The case left behind small objects that mattered in strange ways. A bandana's weave preserved in an evidence bag, rope with knots that matched testimony, a damp ring of mud on a farmer's boot. In a family home, a photograph of Janine seated by a window, smiling faintly, became the image carried into courtrooms and news bulletins. In the paddock where she died, cattle still moved in the months afterward. The dam's surface mirrored sky and cloud, indifferent. Decades passed. New forensic methods, yield from advances in DNA testing, began to alter the shape of many old files. Old swabs were re-examined, old fibers rescanned, and databases that had been inconceivable in 1988 allowed comparisons at a scale previously impossible. In some instances, the fresh work confirmed what investigators had believed. In others, it introduced questions. Small, unidentified male DNA profiles were later reported on the bandana used to gag Janine. Those profiles did not match some of the men convicted. The presence of unidentified profiles did not, in itself, resolve who had touched the bandana or how DNA had transferred. It did, however, reopen lines of inquiry that had long been considered settled. Legal maneuvers followed the new science. Appeals and applications for fresh testing moved through state courts. One convicted man sought additional forensic comparison between the bandana's unknown profiles and the DNA of a different man who had been known by the same nickname as the principal accused, a man who had been questioned shortly after the crime but never charged. Judges weighed the public interest and finality against the principles of a fair trial and the potential relevance of new tests. At times, the Crown resisted further analysis. At other times, the bench ordered it, directing laboratories to compare profiles that had sat unidentified for decades. The procedural record is dense. Affidavits, counsel submissions, margins of typed judgments. Interspersed are the human details preserved in court transcripts, statements read aloud by policemen who had been young at the time and now older, an inspector recalling the awful work of identifying a body, a brother's voice when given permission to speak from the witness box. The family's pleas threaded through hearings, requests that those convicted remain behind bars, an insistence on the gravity of what had happened to their daughter. Outside the courts and forensic labs, the murder lodged in communal memory. Commentators compared it to other brutal crimes of the era. Newspapers ran retrospectives on anniversaries. Memorials appeared in small places. A plaque, a marker, a listing on a wall remembering victims. The Sutherland community held vigils. The spot by the dam was occasionally visited by those who remembered the headlines and the flurry of police vehicles that had once filled the roads. There were also administrative judgments, reviews of how youth offenders should be sentenced, debates about life terms for children, and decisions by international bodies that life sentences handed to juveniles required review under human rights norms. Those legal currents ran alongside the specific facts of the Balding case, shaping the legal status and potential futures of the men who had been imprisoned. Investigations that endure collect details that refuse to lie quietly. The bandana remained a small, stubborn object of contention, cotton-stained, creased, labeled, and relabeled over the years. Unknown male DNA profiles were cataloged. Some were cross-checked against databases, others remained unmatched. Names surfaced in police notebooks, men known to local shelters, men who moved along the margins of city life. One of them, Mark Shorty Wells, appeared in files as a person of interest who, according to contemporaneous notes, had been seen with members of the group around the time the abduction occurred. He was interviewed in 1988 and later denied involvement. His name resurfaced when modern testing identified profiles that could not be matched to the convicted men, prompting applications for comparison between the bandana's unknown profiles and Wells's DNA. Courts considered whether statutory or procedural barriers prevented such tests. Judges considered whether the public interest or the interest of justice required them. United Kingdom, 2004. On the night of August 22, 2004, the English Channel was rough. Wind rising off the Solent, the faint smell of diesel and salt drifting over the Isle of Wight. In the early hours, near the seafront town of Cowes, a 17-year-old girl named Charlotte Harris vanished. She had been at the annual Cowes Week Regatta, a week-long sailing festival that draws thousands to the island each summer. At about 2 a.m., Charlotte was seen leaving a bar near the waterfront. She was dressed casually, jeans, a top, barefoot by some reports after taking off her shoes to walk along the esplanade. Friends later said she had been laughing, a little unsteady, but in good spirits. She told them she was heading back toward her accommodation. She never arrived. The next morning, the sea was calm again. A local fisherman noticed something floating just off East Cowes. It was a human body, face down, drifting near the harbor wall. The Coast Guard was called, and within minutes, rescue boats were out. The body was recovered and soon identified as Charlotte Harris. The time between her disappearance and recovery was less than 12 hours. She had not been reported missing yet. The initial assumption was accidental drowning. The night before had been marked by strong winds and uneven tides, treacherous even for experienced locals. There were no signs of external injuries or assault at first glance. An early toxicology showed alcohol in her system. Her friends had last seen her near the shoreline. She could have fallen and unnoticed. But what puzzled investigators was the location of her body. The currents in that area are strong, and bodies rarely drift toward the harbor from the open coast. The recovery site didn't fit the expected tidal pattern. Pathologists noted bruising on her arms and shoulders inconsistent with a simple fall. A post-mortem examination ruled out sexual assault, but left the cause of death formally as drowning. Still, some aspects of the case refused to settle. The bruising, the odd drift pattern, and witness statements describing voices or movement near the water shortly after Charlotte was last seen. These became small, persistent threads. The Hampshire Constabulary interviewed over 50 people. Several had seen Charlotte that night, walking alone along the esplanade near Egypt Point, one of the darkest sections of the route between Cowes and her temporary lodging. A man walking his dog around 2:20 a.m. told police he heard what he thought was a brief cry or splash, followed by silence. He assumed someone had fallen from a yacht or dinghy and reported it only days later when the story broke. Her parents traveled from Surrey to the island immediately after receiving the call. Reporters gathered near the harbor, filming the police boats moving slowly along the water. For 2 days, divers searched the seabed and shoreline again, but no new evidence was found. Charlotte's shoes were located on a bench near the promenade. Her bag and phone were never recovered. An inquest was opened in Newport, the island's administrative center. The coroner heard detailed reports from the pathologist, police divers, and marine experts about the likely drift patterns between Egypt Point and East Cowes. The findings suggested she could have entered the water somewhere near the promenade, a steep, algae-coated drop where a misstep could be fatal. Her friend spoke at the hearing, fragments of recollection from a night blurred by drink and noise. One remembered Charlotte talking to a man outside the pub, though none could describe him clearly. CCTV footage from nearby venues was collected, but in 2004, low-light resolution was poor and nothing definite emerged. After weeks of testimony, the coroner's verdict was recorded as accidental death by drowning. Yet within the island's close-knit community, uncertainty persisted. Local sailors familiar with the tides argued that the drift pattern made little sense, that she could not have entered the water where the official report placed her. Others noted that her body bore small linear bruises, suggesting restraint or pressure before immersion. The coroner acknowledged these, but accepted the forensic explanation that they could have come from impact with rocks or boat hulls. Over the years, the case has resurfaced in British media whenever similar disappearances occur near water. Her parents have remained quietly insistent that something about the official version felt incomplete, that the bruising and missing belongings suggested more than an accident. Police reviewed the file twice, in 2006 and 2011, each time concluding there was no evidence of foul play. The area near Egypt Point remains one of the few parts of the Cowes Promenade without a continuous railing. The drop to the water is short but steep, and at low tide, the stones are slick. Visitors still walk that route during Cowes Week. The sounds of yachts clinking against their moorings and the smell of seaweed hanging low over the water. A small plaque now sits near the spot where Charlotte was last seen. A simple inscription, for Charlotte, loved and missed. When the wind moves across the channel in late summer, the sound of the masts striking their lines carries across the harbor, metallic, rhythmic, almost like distant bells. Locals say on quiet nights, you can hear the sea slap against the stones where she vanished, a small, steady pulse beneath the noise of the town. Lima, Peru, February 15, 1992. Villa El Salvador lay on the southern edge of Lima, a dense sprawl of sand and cinderblock houses pressing into the desert. The night before, electricity had been cut again, another blackout claimed by the Shining Path, the Maoist guerrilla movement that had waged war across Peru for more than a decade. Maria Elena Moyano, a 33-year-old community organizer and deputy mayor of Villa El Salvador, was at home that Saturday morning. She had become one of the most visible critics of the insurgents, publicly denouncing their attacks on food programs, their bombings, their executions of civilians. The Shining Path called her a traitor. She refused police protection. "I can't live in fear," she had said. That morning, she left for a community rally. Women from the local Vaso de Leche program, the milk distribution network she helped organize, had planned an event to protest violence and call for peace. She wore a white blouse and skirt, carrying a folder of notes. Her 2 sons were with her. By noon, the streets were filling with people. Homemade banners hung from unfinished walls. Children ran between the stalls. Then, around 12:30 p.m., a dark sedan pulled up on Avenida 200 Millis. 3 men got out. Witnesses said one of them shouted her name. Gunfire followed. Maria Elena was shot twice in the chest. As she fell, the gunman dragged her body toward the ground and shot again. Then they fled, tossing an explosive onto her body before disappearing into the maze of alleyways. The blast echoed across the shanty town, shattering windows and scattering debris. Her sons had seen it happen. Neighbors ran forward but were driven back by the smoke. By the time police arrived, there was little to collect: fragments of shrapnel, a twisted folder, and a broken sandal. Her body was taken to a small local clinic, where a crowd gathered in silence. The Shining Path claimed responsibility within hours. Their communiques, distributed overnight through pamphlets and radio, called her an enemy of the people. For them, she represented the grassroots resistance that threatened their control of Peru's poorest neighborhoods. By evening, Lima erupted in grief and anger. Candlelight marches filled the main avenues. Thousands of women walked holding photos of her face. The government declared a day of mourning. President Alberto Fujimori called her death a national tragedy. Investigators from Lima's anti-terrorism unit arrived in Villa El Salvador before dawn. They collected spent shells, fragments of the bomb casing, and witness statements. Locals described the assassins as young men, no older than 25, dressed in civilian clothes. They spoke quietly, with a clipped cadence common to Shining Path militants trained in Ayacucho. The following week, the funeral drew tens of thousands. The procession wound through dusty streets lined with unfinished houses. Some people wept, others stood in silence. Her coffin was carried by women from the Beso de Leche program, the same initiative the guerrillas had tried to destroy. The investigation identified the perpetrators as part of a local Shining Path cell under the command of Abimael Guzman, known as Presidente Gonzalo. The operation that killed her had been authorized personally, according to intercepted communications later revealed during Guzman's trial years afterward. Her death marked a turning point. Public sentiment, once divided, shifted sharply against the guerrillas. For the first time, mass protests against the Shining Path erupted not just in Lima, but in towns across Peru's highlands. Moyano's killing, meant as a warning, instead stripped the movement of much of its urban support. Within months, the government escalated counterinsurgency operations. By September 1992, Guzman himself was captured in a Lima safe house. When prosecutors presented evidence of the Moyano assassination during his trial, the courtroom was quiet except for the hum of television cameras. Her photograph, black and white, taken from her municipal ID, was displayed on the stand. Her story remains documented through official archives, photographs, and fragments of transcript from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that later examined the conflict. One passage, taken from a 2003 session, records the recollection of a witness who had been standing a few meters from her when the shots rang out. She didn't scream, the witness said. It was like she knew it was coming. She just fell. The corner where she died is now a paved intersection. The wall that once held bullet holes has been repainted, though faint impressions remain beneath the plaster. A small bronze plaque marks the site. Maria Elena Moyano, Mujer Valiente. Every February, women from Villa El Salvador walk the same route she took that morning. They carry candles and photographs, moving past the school where she once taught, past the market stalls, and down the long avenue toward the spot where the sedan stopped. The desert wind there is dry, the air sharp with dust. When the procession passes, the city noise fades for a moment. People pause, just briefly, before continuing down the road toward the sea. Los Angeles, United States. August 8, 1969. The city was heavy with heat, the air over Benedict Canyon thick and unmoving. The house at 10050 Cielo Drive stood behind a gate, surrounded by steep hills and eucalyptus trees. Inside, Sharon Tate, 26 years old, 8 months pregnant, was spending the evening with friends. Hairstylist Jay Sebring coffee heiress Abigail Folger and her boyfriend Wojciech Frykowski. Her husband, film director Roman Polanski, was in London. The night was quiet at first. A record player turned lazily in the background. Someone opened a bottle of wine. They were waiting for the humidity to break for sleep to come. Around midnight, a car turned off Benedict Canyon Drive and rolled slowly up the hill. Inside were Charles Tex, Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, members of the Manson family, a cult living at Spahn Ranch in the desert outside Los Angeles. Charles Manson had ordered them to go to the house and destroy everyone in it. They parked near the gate, cut the phone line, and climbed the fence. A few minutes later, headlights appeared down the driveway. 18-year-old Stephen Parent, visiting the caretaker, was leaving. Watson stepped forward and shot him 4 times through the window. The sound barely carried up the hill. The killers approached the house. Watson cut a screen to enter through a window and unlocked the front door for the others. Inside, they began to move room by room. Frykowski was asleep on the couch. Sebring was in a chair near Sharon. When Frykowski stirred, Watson struck him with the butt of his gun and tied his hands with a towel. Sebring protested. Watson shot him once in the chest. Sharon screamed. From there, the house descended into chaos. Frykowski broke free and stumbled toward the lawn, bleeding. Atkins followed, stabbing as he tried to run. Folger fled through the bedroom door, sprinting into the yard. Krenwinkel caught her near the bushes and stabbed her dozens of times. Frykowski collapsed nearby. Inside, Tate stood in the living room. She begged them to spare her unborn child. Atkins later said she told her, "You're going to die, and there's nothing you can do about it." Watson stabbed her repeatedly while she called for her mother. The word pig was written on the front door in her blood. By dawn, the house was silent again. The next morning, the maid arrived and found the scene. She ran screaming to a neighbor's house. Police arrived around 9 a.m. and walked through the front door into what one detective later called something from a nightmare. There were no clear footprints, only blood smeared across walls and floors. At first, the murders seemed senseless. The victims had no known enemies. The newspapers called it a ritual slaying. For weeks, Los Angeles was frozen in fear. A few nights later, another set of murders occurred. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca killed in their Los Feliz home. The same messages were scrawled in blood on the walls. Rise, death to pigs, helter skelter. The connection between the two cases wasn't made until months later, when a fight at Spahn Ranch led to the arrest of several Manson followers. Susan Atkins, in jail for another crime, began to talk, describing the murders in detail to his cellmate. By December 1969, Charles Manson and several of his followers were charged. The trial began in June 1970 and lasted 9 months. Manson carved an X into his forehead, claiming he had removed himself from the establishment. The female defendants followed suit. During the trial, the prosecution revealed Manson's helter-skelter belief, a prophecy of an impending race war that he claimed the murders would help ignite. He hadn't been at the Cielo Drive house that night, but his words had guided those who were. The jury found all of them guilty of 7 counts of murder. They were sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment when California briefly abolished the death penalty. The house at 10050 Cielo Drive stood for nearly 30 years after the killings. It was eventually demolished in 1994. The site is now part of a new property with a different address, though locals say the land still feels unnaturally quiet. The original front gate, once splattered with blood, is kept in storage by private collectors. Inside the LAPD archives, the crime scene photos remain sealed, labeled Cielo Drive, August 1969. Neighbors still remember the sound of helicopters that morning, circling for hours above the canyon. The sun was bright, the sky cloudless, and beneath the eucalyptus trees, the house was already filled with reporters, police, and the smell of blood drying in the heat. Ireland, 1996. The house stood on a hill overlooking the Atlantic, near the village of Shull, West Cork. In December 1996, the wind came hard off the sea, rattling the metal gate at the end of the drive. Sophie Toscan du Plantier, a 39-year-old French television producer, had arrived from Paris a few days before Christmas. She came alone, as she often did, to her holiday cottage on the coast. On the evening of December 22nd, neighbors saw lights moving inside the house. Sophie made a few phone calls, one to a friend in France, another to her husband, film producer Daniel Toscan Duplantier. She mentioned she might return to Paris earlier than planned. Later, she was seen briefly by a neighbor walking down the lane toward her home before darkness settled over the valley. The next morning, December 23rd, a neighbor named Shirley Foster drove past and saw something in the entrance to Sophie's driveway, a figure lying in the frost. She stopped her car and walked closer. Sophie's body was face down near the gate, her night clothes torn, her dressing gown twisted around her legs. Her head and face had been brutally beaten. The scene was quiet except for the wind. The ground around her was frozen, her hair matted with blood. Pieces of slate and a heavy concrete block lay nearby. Gardaí, the Irish police, arrived within the hour. The first officers saw signs that Sophie had tried to flee. Broken branches, disturbed grass, and barefoot tracks in the frost leading back toward the house. The front door was locked from the inside. A single window pane had been broken, possibly by her, as she tried to reach the key. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of theft, no clear motive. Sophie had no known enemies in Ireland. In the village, she was seen as polite but private, someone who kept to herself. Most people only knew her from the occasional trip into town for groceries or film magazines. That night, the West Cork Garda station became the center of one of the largest murder investigations in Irish history. Over the next few days, officers interviewed dozens of locals. They found that one man, a British journalist named Ian Bailey, had shown a striking interest in the case. Bailey lived nearby, in a cottage less than 3 miles from Sophie's home, with his partner, Jules Thomas. He was one of the first reporters to call the French press about the killing. Bailey had arrived in Ireland years earlier, working freelance for Irish newspapers. He was tall, loud, and often drank heavily. Several locals later told Gardaí that Bailey had made offhand remarks implying knowledge of the crime before it was public. Others said they had seen scratches on his hands and arms the morning after the murder. Bailey claimed he had injured himself cutting down a Christmas tree. In February 1997, police searched his house. They found blood-stained clothing and diaries describing violent outbursts. Bailey was arrested twice, once in 1997 and again in 1998, but never charged. The director of public prosecutions concluded there wasn't enough evidence to proceed. In France, the reaction was different. The French judiciary, which allows for trials in absentia, began its own investigation. They regarded Bailey as the prime suspect. In 2010, a French judge issued a European arrest warrant for him. Ireland refused extradition, citing lack of evidence. Bailey continued to live in West Cork, where he became a kind of local curiosity, the man accused of a murder he denied committing. He maintained his innocence for decades, giving interviews, writing poetry, and occasionally confronting journalists who covered the case. Meanwhile, Sophie's family kept pressing for justice. Her parents, Georges and Marguerite, visited the site many times. Each December, the locals held a small memorial near the gate where her body was found. In 2019, more than 2 decades after the killing, a Paris court tried Bailey in absentia. He was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Ireland again refused extradition. He never served time. The details of the night have never been fully explained. The forensic photographs show Sophie lying near the gate, one arm bent beneath her, her feet bare and covered in frost. The attack was frenzied, more than 50 blows, yet there were no signs of sexual assault. Investigators believe she fled from her home, possibly after hearing something outside, and was cornered near the driveway. The cottage remains there, still overlooking the sea. The original iron gate has been replaced, the concrete drive patched where the blood once froze in the winter air. Bailey died in 2021, alone in his home in Bantry, reportedly from heart failure. His death left the case unresolved. The official Garda file lists the case as unsolved homicide, The path leading up to Sophie's house is overgrown now, the hedges thick and untrimmed. In winter, the wind still moves through the valley with the same dull roar it had that night, carrying nothing but the sound of the sea and the echo of what was found there just before Christmas. The United States, 2011. It began on a clear May morning in 2011. Timothy James Pitson, 6 years old, was dropped off at Greenman Elementary School in Aurora, Illinois, by his father, James Pitson. The school day had barely begun when, at 8:30 a.m., Timothy's mother, Amy Fry Pitson, arrived unexpectedly. She told the staff there was a family emergency and signed her son out early. No one questioned her. The school security footage shows her holding Timothy's hand as they walked down the hall, the boy wearing a Spider-Man backpack, looking small beside her. They got into her silver 2004 Ford Expedition and drove away. By that afternoon, James couldn't reach her. Calls went straight to voicemail. At 3 p.m., Amy stopped at an auto repair shop in Aurora to have her car serviced. Surveillance video captured her chatting casually with the mechanic while Timothy played nearby, calm and cheerful. There was nothing unusual. From there, Amy drove west toward the Wisconsin border. That night, they checked into the Key Lime Cove Resort in Gurnee, a family water park hotel. The next morning, May 12th, the two were seen on security cameras waiting in line at the check-in desk, Timothy bouncing on his heels. Later, they were spotted again at a zoo in Brookfield. They were last seen together around 1:30 p.m. At 10 p.m. that night, Amy's SUV was recorded entering the parking lot of the Rockford Inn, about 120 miles northwest of Aurora. She checked in alone. The following morning, May 13th, housekeeping staff found her body. She had slit her wrists and neck with a box cutter. The coroner ruled it a suicide. A note lay beside her. In her handwriting, it read, "Timothy is safe. He is with people who will love and care for him. You will never find him." There was blood on the note and no sign of the boy. Police traced her movements through toll records, surveillance footage, and witness statements. Between the morning of May 12th and her death, Amy had driven hundreds of miles through Sterling, Dixon, and Mount Carroll, small towns west of Chicago. Receipts showed she bought food, children's clothes, and crayons. Timothy was seen with her at the Kalahari Resort in Wisconsin Dells that Thursday night. After that, there were no confirmed sightings. When investigators recovered Amy's vehicle, they found traces of Timothy's blood in the back seat. It was later determined to have come from a nosebleed weeks earlier. There were also traces of dirt and vegetation consistent with a rural area. Specifically, soil types found near Sterling and Mount Carroll, close to old gravel roads and isolated farm fields. The box cutter Amy used to kill herself had only her DNA on it. Her phone was missing, later discovered months later by construction workers off Route 78 in Mount Carroll. Its SIM card was gone. In the weeks following the disappearance, the search widened. Helicopters, drones, and cadaver dogs swept across cornfields and forest preserves. Police divers searched ponds and quarries. Nothing surfaced. James Pitson appeared in front of reporters often, pale and exhausted. He said Amy had struggled with depression and had previously threatened to take Timothy away from him. They had argued about her mental health. He told police she once said she could never let Timothy be taken away from her. Detectives believed she had planned the trip carefully, withdrawing cash from multiple ATMs, removing her name from certain family accounts, and contacting no one after leaving Aurora. Her phone's last ping was near Sterling at 1:30 p.m. on May 13th, about 6 hours before her body was found. The mystery deepened over time. No evidence ever emerged of any individuals who might have taken Timothy in, and no family members or friends reported being contacted by Amy about her plans. For years, leads came and went. In 2019, a 23-year-old man appeared in Kentucky claiming to be Timothy Pitson. He said he had escaped from captors who kept him in a motel room. News of his reappearance spread quickly. DNA testing was done within hours. It wasn't him. The man was an ex-convict from Ohio named Brian Reaney. The case returned to silence. FBI analysts revisited every known location Amy had stopped. They noted that in the final 24 hours of her life, she had driven in circles through rural routes near Savannah, Illinois, close to the Mississippi River. There are old quarries, bridges, and stretches of woodland there, where the soil matches that found on her SUV. The official line remains that Timothy's whereabouts are unknown. Investigators believe two possibilities: that Amy left him with someone, perhaps from her past, though none have ever been identified, or that she killed him and concealed his body before taking her own life. James Pitson has said he believes his son is still alive. He keeps the same phone number in case Timothy ever calls. The last confirmed image of the boy shows him in the Key Lime Cove resort lobby, standing next to his mother, wearing a blue t-shirt and black shorts, looking up at the clerk as she checks them in. His expression is calm, his hair neatly cut. The timestamp reads May 12, 2011, 10 a.m. The camera pans away after a few seconds, the two of them walking out of frame toward the doors into the bright late morning light. That was the last time anyone ever saw him. Overland Park, Kansas, 2007. It was a warm June evening when Kelsey Smith, 18 years old, left her home to run a quick errand at a local Target store. She had recently graduated from high school and was preparing for college. Her family described her as responsible, focused, the kind of girl who never failed to check in. At 7:07 p.m., surveillance footage showed Kelsey entering the Target. She browsed for a few minutes, picked out a graduation gift for her boyfriend, a compact stereo, and paid at the register. On camera, she looked relaxed, unaware that she was being watched. Outside, in the parking lot, another camera caught her walking toward her car. A man appeared suddenly from the shadows. Within seconds, he forced her into the vehicle. The car pulled out of the lot at 7:10 p.m. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. Her parents grew alarmed almost immediately when she didn't return home. By 9 p.m., they had reported her missing. Police began their search that night, locating her car abandoned outside a Macy's across the street from the Target. Her purse, phone, and belongings were still inside. Investigators retrieved surveillance tapes from surrounding businesses. They saw the same young man who had approached her, tall, muscular, wearing jeans and a white shirt. His face wasn't visible, but his movements were clear. He had waited near her car, pacing, watching. The FBI and local law enforcement combined efforts to trace her phone signal. Cellular triangulation narrowed it down to an area near Longview Lake, across the state line in Missouri. Search teams fanned out across the woods and shoreline. 3 days after her disappearance, on June 6, 2007, they found her body in a wooded area near the lake. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with her own belt. The man seen on the surveillance tapes was soon identified as Edwin Roy Hall, 26, a stranger to Kelsey. He had followed her through the store, waiting until she was alone in the parking lot before attacking. When confronted, Hall claimed he didn't remember killing her. DNA evidence and phone records placed him at the scene. He eventually pled guilty to capital murder and aggravated kidnapping to avoid the death penalty. The case drew national attention not only for its brutality, but for the speed with which technology led to her recovery. The cell tower data, released to police after a delay, prompted new discussions about privacy laws and emergency access in missing person cases. In the aftermath, Kansas enacted the Kelsey Smith Act, requiring wireless providers to release location data immediately when police believe someone is in danger. In the Target parking lot, where the abduction began, there's now a small plaque and a light pole with her name on it. The footage from that night, the simple act of a young woman walking to her car, remains one of the most unsettling and unforgettable recordings in modern true crime. New York City, 2006. In the early hours of February 25th, 24-year-old Amet St. Gian left a bar in Soho called The Falls just before closing time. She was a graduate student at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, studying forensic science. Friends said she was cautious and disciplined, the kind of person who double-locked her door and texted when she got home. That night, she never did. At around 4 a.m., after celebrating a friend's birthday, she decided to stay for one more drink. Her friends left, assuming she would call a cab soon after. Cameras caught her inside the bar speaking with the bouncer, Daryl Littlejohn, a man with a long criminal record. She left sometime after closing. No one saw her alive again. When she failed to return home, her sister and friends reported her missing. Police began combing through security footage and phone data. Within 36 hours, a road worker in East New York, Brooklyn, discovered her body near a desolate stretch of road off Fountain Avenue, an industrial area known for abandoned lots and dumping grounds. She had been bound with plastic ties, gagged with a sock and packing tape, and her head was wrapped tightly in duct tape. Autopsy results showed she had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Detectives immediately focused on the last person known to see her alive, the bouncer from the falls. Littlejohn had a history of impersonating law enforcement officers and prior charges for robbery and kidnapping. DNA recovered from beneath Emmet's fingernails matched his. Fiber and tape found on her body were consistent with materials discovered in a Queens warehouse where Littlejohn sometimes worked nights. The case unfolded rapidly under intense public pressure. New York tabloids printed her photo daily, calling for justice and highlighting the brutality of the crime. Littlejohn denied knowing her, but the physical evidence contradicted him. During the trial, prosecutors outlined a sequence of events pieced together from surveillance tapes and forensic timelines. After the bar closed, Littlejohn offered Emmet a ride. She was forced into a van and taken across the East River, restrained, and killed sometime before dawn. The defense argued there was no direct eyewitness and that the forensic evidence was circumstantial. But the DNA, the zip ties, and the duct tape formed an unbroken chain. In 2009, Daryl Littlejohn was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Following Emmet's death, the Falls Bar shut down permanently. Her classmates at John Jay College established a scholarship in her name for women studying criminal justice. The block where she was last seen, quiet now, the neon signs long gone, is still often mentioned in late-night true crime shows. The case stands as one of New York's most meticulously documented abduction investigations, recorded frame by frame from a single night that began with a birthday celebration and ended beneath the flickering lights of a closed bar. Marshallville, Ohio, 1982. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, July 17th, when 11-year-old Krista Harrison left home to collect aluminum cans with a friend. The two girls rode their bikes to a park just a few blocks from her house, a familiar route, small town safe. Around 2:30 p.m., a gray or silver van pulled up near the park's entrance. Krista's friend later told police that a man got out, grabbed Krista, and forced her into the vehicle before speeding away. The van disappeared down the country road within seconds. Police were alerted immediately. Roadblocks went up, neighbors searched fields, creeks, and barns. The description was vague, a white male, middle-aged, wearing jeans and a dark shirt, but the image of the gray van stuck. For 6 days, the search expanded across Wayne County and beyond. Then, on July 24th, a couple walking their dog near Big Darby Creek, about 40 miles away in rural Ashland County, noticed a bundle of clothing tangled in weeds. Inside was Krista's body, wrapped in a blanket. An autopsy confirmed she had been sexually assaulted and strangled shortly after being abducted. There were no defensive wounds. The attack had been swift. The abduction shocked the region, and for years, it haunted law enforcement. The FBI joined the case, suspecting it might be connected to other similar abductions in Ohio. Leads came and went. A man matching the van description was questioned in multiple counties, but nothing held. Then, in 1983, another case, the murder of Tina Harmon, 12, from nearby Creston, drew comparisons. Same general area, same pattern, similar van sighting. Later, the 1990 murder of Debbie Smith, also in Ohio, was added to the suspected list. Decades later, in the early 2000s, investigators began re-examining all three cases using modern DNA testing. Evidence preserved from the Harmon case produced a hit. Robert Anthony Buell, a former city planning official from Akron, previously convicted of kidnapping and rape. though Buell was executed in 2002 for the murder of Tina Harmon. Investigators believed he was also responsible for the abductions of Krista Harrison and Debbie Smith. However, no DNA was found linking him directly to Krista's murder. Only circumstantial similarities and geographic overlap. The FBI eventually listed him as the prime suspect, but never closed the case. Officially, Krista's murder remains unsolved. In Marshallville, a memorial stands at the park where she was taken, a simple stone with her name engraved, flowers often placed beneath it. Residents still recall the search parties, the helicopters, the image of the grave van. 40 years later, the road where she vanished is quieter now, the park smaller than it seemed then. The case file, thick with decades of reports and interviews, still sits in the Wayne County Sheriff's Office, open, unmarked, and waiting. Blacksburg, Virginia, 2016. Nicole Madison Lovell was 13 years old when she vanished from her family's apartment on January 27th. Her mother found her window open and her phone missing. On her dresser were the medications she needed daily for a liver transplant she'd undergone as a child. Police began searching immediately. Nicole was small for her age, shy but active online. She'd been using social media apps like Kik and Facebook Messenger, chatting with people she met in groups. Friends said she often spoke about older boys she talked to there. Investigators pulled her phone records and quickly found a name that didn't belong in her usual contacts. A college student at nearby Virginia Tech, David Eisenhower, 18 years old, an engineering major and track athlete. Surveillance footage from her apartment complex showed a shadowy figure outside her window around midnight. Tire tracks were found nearby. 3 days later, on January 30th, police arrested Eisenhower at his dorm room. Shortly afterward, they took another student, Natalie Keepers, into custody for helping to conceal the crime. That same day, investigators discovered Nicole's body off a remote road in Surry County, North Carolina, more than 80 miles from Blacksburg. She had been stabbed to death. Eisenhower initially denied knowing her. Later, faced with messages retrieved from Kik, he admitted meeting her online under a fake name. He told friends she had threatened to expose their relationship. Prosecutors said Eisenhower feared the discovery could ruin his life, a college freshman involved with a middle school girl, so he planned her death. Keepers helped him dispose of the body, later leading police to the site. The trial revealed a disturbing sequence of events. Eisenhower had picked Nicole up near her home that night, drove her out of town, and killed her within hours. Messages recovered from his phone detailed the planning. In 2018, David Eisenhower pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, abduction, and concealing a body. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Natalie Keepers received 40 years for helping to dispose of Nicole's remains. The case drew national attention because of the role of social media in the abduction. Nicole's parents, who believed she was asleep in her room that night, said afterward they hadn't realized how easily strangers could reach children through messaging apps designed to disappear conversations. In Blacksburg, the community built a small memorial for Nicole outside the middle school she attended. Flowers, candles, a photo of her smiling in a blue sweatshirt. The park near her apartment remains quiet. The same swing sets and benches where she spent afternoons before that winter night, when she climbed out her window for what she thought was a meeting with a friend. Poudre Canyon, Colorado, October 1999. The trail leading through the Comanche Peak wilderness looks calm now. Pine needles, river stones, and the faint echo of running water. But for those who remember, every bend in the path once carried the sound of voices calling a child's name. 3-year-old Jared Adadero lived with his father, Alan, in a small lodge near Bellevue, Colorado. They ran the Poudre Canyon Resort, a quiet stretch of cabins surrounded by forest. The boy was cheerful, curious, and known to follow guests down to the nearby creek to throw stones into the current. On the morning of October 2nd, 1999, a group from the local Christian Singles Club stopped by the lodge. They were friends of Alan's sister and planned a day hike up the Big South Trail. Jared wanted to go. His father hesitated. The trail climbed steeply, winding through thick forest and narrow ledges. But after reassurance from the group that they'd keep watch, he agreed. It was a decision he would replay for years. The hikers, about 11 in total, left late morning. They carried small packs, cameras, and snacks. For the first stretch, Jared ran ahead, darting between trees, collecting sticks and pine cones. Witnesses recalled him laughing, pointing out chipmunks. Then, as the group spread out along the narrow trail, he vanished. At first they assumed he had run ahead. One hiker said she'd seen him near a bend by the river. Another thought he'd fallen behind. Minutes stretched into an hour. By 1 p.m., they realized he was gone. The group returned to the lodge in panic. Alan immediately called 911, and by nightfall, Larimer County Search and Rescue had arrived with volunteers, dogs, and helicopters equipped with infrared sensors. Snow began to fall. The next several days blurred into a massive coordinated search. The terrain was brutal, steep, uneven, dense with underbrush. Tracks found near the riverbank led nowhere. Rescue teams combed every ravine, calling his name until their voices cracked. Planes flew low, scanning the tree line. They found nothing. As the search extended past a week, speculation filled the air. Some believed Jared had been taken by a mountain lion, though no drag marks or blood were ever found. Others thought he might have fallen into the Poudre River, but divers recovered no sign of a body. Temperatures dropped each night. Survival seemed impossible. The case quickly drew national attention. Reporters set up outside the lodge, and television crews aired footage of the rescue operation. Alan gave interviews daily, visibly exhausted, refusing to leave the canyon. He slept in his truck, scanning the trailhead each dawn. For months, the forest remained silent. Search teams withdrew, leaving only markers and maps. Then, in 2003, nearly 4 years later, hikers exploring a high ridge about 500 feet above the trail stumbled upon a small shoe. It was a child's white sneaker, sun-bleached and partly buried. Nearby, they found another shoe, a fleece jacket, and a few scattered bones. DNA confirmed they belonged to Jared. The items were found far above the area previously searched, in terrain almost inaccessible for a small child. Wildlife experts noted that mountain lions sometimes drag prey uphill, though the clothing appeared mostly intact, without tearing consistent with an animal attack. The coroner ruled the cause of death as undetermined. No trauma, no clear evidence of predation, no sign of abduction. The only certainty was the timeline. The child had vanished within minutes, and his remains were discovered years later, far beyond where anyone thought he could climb. To this day, experienced hikers still remark on the location. The ridge sits more than 550 vertical feet above the trail, with loose rock and no clear path. Even adults struggle to reach it without equipment. How Jared's belongings ended up there remains a mystery quietly debated among rescuers. Alan Adaduro later wrote a book detailing the search, the investigations, and the lingering questions that followed. He described the sound of the forest at night, the wind moving through the canyon, the distant rush of the river, and how easily it can conceal a whisper, a voice, or a small child's cry. The Poudre Canyon Resort still stands, though the trailhead has been modified and signs now warn hikers of difficult terrain. Visitors sometimes leave small toys or stones near the marker where Jared's name is carved. There are no cameras on that trail, no witnesses left alive who can say exactly what happened. Just the narrow switchbacks, the smell of pine, and the echo of footsteps that fade before anyone can turn to see where they lead. Edmonton, Alberta, February 23, 2001. The cold kept time that night. Every second measured in blue breath and the slow dimming of a small, impossible pulse. The house on the quiet side street was unremarkable. A low bungalow with a back door that stuck in winter and a porch light on a crooked timer. Inside, adults slept in one room while a toddler napped in a pack-and-play nearby. Around 2 a.m., that child slipped outside, into air so cold it erased signs of life. Erica was 13 months old at the time. The temperature had plunged to about minus 11 degrees Fahrenheit. She and her mother, 26-year-old Layla Nordby, had been staying at a friend's house that night. Earlier, Layla and a friend had left the home for errands, leaving the babysitter temporarily. When they returned in the early hours, the babysitter exited through the back door, which had a defective latch. That night, Erica wandered outside wearing nothing but a diaper. When Layla awoke later and felt Erica absent beside her, she raced through the bedroom and found the toddler missing. She followed faint footprints through the snow, a short, solitary line from the back door to a shallow drift beside the garage. There, face down, she found Erica, frozen and still. She wrapped her daughter in a blanket and began CPR while calling for help. Paramedics arrived, but no pulse could be found. Her core temperature registered approximately 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Clinically, she was considered dead. At the scene, rescuers struggled. Erica's limbs were rigid. Her airway had collapsed. They were unable to intubate her. She was rushed to Stollery Children's Health Center, where doctors began an intricate process of rewarming and resuscitation. Blankets, warmed intravenous fluids, external warming devices were used. Deep down, her body was fighting with everything it had left. By morning, her heart resumed beating. It did not pulse with ease, but with hesitant mechanical rhythm. The cold had forced her body into a state of suspended metabolism, so slow that the machines initially read her as dead. Her recovery then became a matter not just of medicine, but of delicate balance. Rewarm too fast, and tissues could fail. Rewarm too slow, and organs might not survive. Medical staff later reflected that Erica's survival fell into the realm of the extraordinary. Frostbite had already inflicted damage. Her hands and feet were threatened. Surgeons considered possible amputation, especially on her left foot. Over time, grafts and physiotherapy helped restore function. In hospital reports, she moved, smiled, and interacted. The brain scans showed no obvious damage. Among clinicians, she became a rare living example of how extreme hypothermia can sometimes spare the vital core when the cold buys time. Meanwhile, the public watched. The media picked up her story rapidly. Miracle baby, Canada's miracle child. Donations flowed. The family faced intense scrutiny, especially the mother, whose background and ethnicity were sometimes invoked in ways that complicated the narrative. Layla was detained by police for several hours on suspicion of neglect, a procedural act that nonetheless became magnified in the press. The family later relocated to escape attention. Beyond the medical drama lay the structural detail, the latch on the door. The lawsuit filed later argued that the faulty latch allowed Erica to slip out. Landlords and tenants were named in a civil suit seeking compensation for failing to repair it. After 6 weeks in hospital, Erica was discharged. Scarring and slight deformation of her left foot remained, needing special footwear for a time. Yet by anniversaries, interviews, and remembrances, she was often portrayed as fully recovered. Still, in medical journals and emergency medicine circles, her case remains a reference point for the limits of reversible hypothermia, for the thin threads between life and clinical death. In the years since, some have speculated whether Erica's case might help shape protocols for rewarming, CPR decisions in hypothermia, and prognostic judgments. But for those who were there, paramedics, nurses, family, it was never just a case. It was a moment when every pivot of cold, timing, and human will met under impossible odds. The snow remains, the house on that side street, the back door latch, the footprints that vanished into the drift. These become elements of memory. Erica survived because that night, for reasons no single person could claim, the body slowed enough for hope to catch up. Dublin, Ireland, August 22nd, 2012. She believed the hills would carry her voice. Instead, the mountains held her silence. Elaine O'Hara was 36 years old, a childcare worker from South Dublin, known to friends as gentle and steady, but burdened by depression, diabetes, dyslexia, and years of mental health care. That afternoon, she was discharged from hospital care and told a friend she was simply going for a walk in the park. She left her flat at Bellarmine Plaza, step aside, and by evening her family reported her missing. Her Fiat Punto, sat unattended at the edge of Shanganag Park beside the cemetery where her mother lay buried. CCTV captured her crossing a footbridge. After that, she vanished. On September 13, 2013, more than a year later, a dog walker in the Dublin Mountains discovered human bones scattered across a clearing near Killicky. Investigators traced the remains to Elaine by dental records. Near them, mail, a key tag from a loyalty card, and 2 mobile phones were found. Among them, devices that revealed a chain of text messages to and from a man named Graham Dwyer. Architect, father of 3, husband, father-in-law, friend. These messages revealed a relationship between Elaine and Dwyer that was clandestine, controlling, erotic, and lethal. Texts stretched back years. Elaine told him she was slave. He called himself master. She described being tied, gagged, marked. He wrote of knives, blood. When I stab, I feel alive. On the day she disappeared, her last text, one of many, read, "Go down to shore and wait." Hours later, she was gone. Dwyer's alibi crumbled. Digital phone mast data placed one of his devices near the reservoir, where gear belonging to Elaine, belts, cuffs, a leather gag, had been found during a drought when water levels were low. In the trial of 2015, the prosecution described a man who selected his victim, manipulated her vulnerabilities, arranged the place and the time, and stabbed her for sexual gratification. The jury found him guilty. He was given mandatory life imprisonment. Investigators pieced together the scene. After her hospital discharge, Elaine returned home, retrieved a second mobile phone separate to her usual one, then drove to Shanganag Park and crossed into a railway footbridge that led to the cliff-edge paths above the sea. Dwyer's phone signals placed him in that region at the same time. A short walk later, Elaine's car sat idle while the killer took her into the hills. His tools, her trust, the remote slope of the mountain, all prepared. Evidence, 2 mobile phones, thousands of texts, CCTV of Dwyer entering the apartment block of Elaine with a concealed phone, a bag of restraints dredged from Vartry Reservoir. Witnesses and phone analysts testified to the depth of Dwyer's interest in bondage control knives. Elaine's family described her strength and her struggles. Her dreams of becoming a Montessori teacher, her eagerness to help children, her persistent fear of control. She had told her father, "He ties me up and masturbates over me." In court, both described the moment the quiet facade collapsed. Dwyer's appeal avenues narrowed. In March 2023, the Irish Court of Appeal dismissed his challenge against the conviction. In 2024, the Supreme Court denied any further appeal. The case remains a landmark in Irish criminal law, not only for its brutality, but for how investigators used phone metadata, text message analysis, CCTV review, and forensic retrieval from a shallow reservoir during drought conditions. The killer's mobile signal tied him to the scene. The restraints matched gear found in his possession. The dark intelligence of the murder, the planning, the lure, the isolation of the victim in the wooded mountain clearing, led media to call it one of the most chilling crimes in Ireland's recent history. Elaine's name, once lost in records of disappearance, is now recorded in the margins as a victim of predation dressed in normal life. Even today, in late August, the slopes of Killicky fall silent by dusk. Hikers sometimes pause where the clearing lies, where the bones are found. Nearby, a plaque names no victim, and a trail leads to nowhere. Antioch, California, June 1980. The apartment complex on G Street was quiet that summer, the air heavy with heat and the faint hum of power lines. From the outside, nothing about the low beige building suggested what would soon unfold, a crime that would linger for decades without a name attached to it. Suzanne Bombardier was 14 years old, a bright student from Antioch Junior High, visiting her older sister's apartment for the weekend. She had been staying there to help babysit her nieces. On the night of June 21st, 1980, Suzanne went to bed in the living room after watching television. The sliding glass door to the balcony was left slightly open to let in the breeze. By morning, she was gone. Her sister woke to find the apartment door ajar. At first, she thought Suzanne had gone for a walk, but her shoes were still by the couch. There were no signs of a struggle, just an empty blanket and a pillow on the floor. Police were called, and the small Antioch department began what would become one of the area's longest unsolved murder investigations. Search teams fanned out across the surrounding blocks, checking playgrounds, canals, and parks. Flyers with Suzanne's photograph appeared in shop windows. Days passed with no leads. 5 days later, on June 27th, a fisherman on the nearby San Joaquin River spotted something floating near the shoreline. It was the body of a young girl, partially wrapped in a sheet. She had been bound with strips of cloth and showed signs of sexual assault. The coroner confirmed her identity through dental records. Suzanne Bombardier had been stabbed once through the chest. The city of Antioch changed after that. Doors that had once been left unlocked stayed bolted. Parents stopped letting their children walk to the store alone. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, and classmates. They collected fibers, fingerprints, and samples from the sheet. Everything that could be preserved under 1980 standards. But the technology wasn't there yet. For years, the case sat in the evidence room, revisited periodically as new leads emerged and faded. In the 1990s, when DNA profiling became a reliable tool, the preserved evidence was submitted for testing. Results confirmed the presence of male DNA, but no matches appeared in any database. Then, in 2014, cold case investigator Robert Mortimer from the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office reopened the file. He ordered modern analysis of the biological material using updated forensic techniques. The DNA profile was run again, this time against a broader national database. In 2015, the match appeared. The sample linked to a man named Mitchell Lynn Backham, a longtime resident of the Bay Area with prior convictions for kidnapping, sexual assault, and burglary. In 1980, he had lived only a few blocks from the Bombardier family. He had even been questioned briefly during the original investigation, but released due to lack of evidence. In December 2017, nearly 38 years after Suzanne's death, Backham was arrested at his home in Antioch. Detectives arrived quietly at night, finding him sitting in his living room watching television. He was 63. During interrogation, he denied everything, but the DNA evidence was irrefutable. The case went to trial in 2022. Prosecutors presented the forensics, the original reports, and testimony from surviving family members. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days before returning a guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and rape. In the courtroom, Suzanne's family members, now gray-haired, some with their own children, sat in silence as the sentence was read. Life without parole. It was the ending of a case that had haunted an entire community, though not the kind of closure anyone could describe as peace. The building on G Street still stands, though remodeled. New families live there, unaware that 4 decades earlier, a teenager disappeared from one of those small, sun-warmed rooms. Her photograph, once taped to telephone poles and shop doors, now rests in a file marked closed. But in the records of Contra Costa County, her name still appears often, a reminder of a time when a town learned that even quiet places can hold something cold beneath their surface. The trail of evidence that once seemed thin had never vanished. It had simply waited, sealed in a paper envelope, for science to catch up. And when it finally did, the truth stepped out of the shadows of that summer night and back into the light, where it had always been waiting. Florence, Italy, March 1980. The morning air in Florence carried a faint chill, the kind that sharpened every sound. The bells from Santa Maria Novella drifted through narrow streets, echoing between ochre walls and shuttered windows. When Isabella Gowd left her apartment that Sunday morning, she was carrying a folder of sketches and notes, reminders of the art restoration course she'd been taking near Piazza della Repubblica. She didn't return. By early evening, her landlady noticed her absence. Isabella was punctual, cautious, and polite to a fault. A British exchange student who had come to Italy for a semester that was meant to last the rest of her life. She had been living alone in a small top-floor flat, one of those converted attics with low beams and a single dormer window that faced the Arno. That night, a local groundskeeper near Fiesole a hillside area overlooking the city, found a satchel in the brush. Inside were Isabella's sketchbook, a small camera, and her student ID from the university. About 30 meters away, the body was discovered, partially covered by fallen leaves. Her coat was torn, one shoe missing, and her wrists bore marks suggesting she'd been restrained. The crime scene told a story of control more than chaos. There was no sign of a struggle nearby, suggesting she had been transported there. Forensic teams from Florence's Polizia Scientifica examined the area, photographing footprints and tire impressions in the soft earth. The time of death was placed sometime between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. News of the killing spread fast. Another young woman dead in the hills near Florence. Locals began to whisper about a connection to the monster of Florence, whose attacks on couples had begun years earlier. But investigators soon separated the cases. Isabella's death carried none of the same forensic signatures. She wasn't found in a car, and there were no indications of the pair targeting typical of those crimes. Hers seemed more personal. Detectives traced her last known movements. She had stopped for coffee near Piazza San Ambrogio, chatted briefly with another student, and mentioned heading to the outskirts for sketching landscapes. Several witnesses recalled a small blue Fiat 127 idling near the cafe that morning, driven by a man described as ordinary, older, possibly a teacher. When investigators canvassed local art schools, they identified a visiting lecturer who had briefly mentored Isabella, a man in his 40s known for private tutoring sessions. His name appeared once in her notes, underlined, beside the words composition meeting. The police questioned him, but he denied any involvement, claiming he had not seen her that day. His car, however, matched the witness description. Search warrants led to his apartment, where they found maps of the Fiesole Hills and several undeveloped rolls of film. The negatives, once processed, showed dozens of female students in candid poses around campus, many unaware they'd been photographed. Among them was Isabella. Still, none of it directly linked him to her death. Without fingerprints, DNA, or an eyewitness, prosecutors lacked enough to charge. The man quietly left Florence the following month. For years, Isabella's case remained suspended between rumor and paperwork. Her parents, who had flown in from the UK, stayed long enough to collect her belongings, the sketchbooks, the pencils, and a broken umbrella found near her apartment door. They returned home with little more than those objects, their daughter's name now a brief headline in the La Nazione archives. In later police files, the case reappeared briefly in connection with a string of unsolved assaults on foreign students in Tuscany during the late 1970s and early 1980s. The pattern was vague. Young women, often alone, usually approached by someone in an academic or artistic setting. But no formal connection was ever proven. The site near Fiesole was eventually absorbed back in a quiet anonymity. The grass grew back over the dirt, the tire impressions long erased by rain. Tourists now visit the lookout above, unaware that beneath their feet, a cold case once lingered. Locals who remember it sometimes still refer to that spring as El Anno della Ragazza Inglese, the year of the English girl. In the police archives, the folder remains slim, the ink on its labels faded, the corners frayed from handling. There are photographs of the hillside, a brief witness statement, a list of seized items, and, on the final page, a single sentence handwritten by the original investigator. Likely known to her. That's where it ends. Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 1962. In the summer of 1962, Rio de Janeiro was preparing for carnival. The streets shimmered with color. Paper banners strung between light poles, brass bands rehearsing in courtyards, the smell of fried cassava rising through the heat. At night, the city pulsed with samba and laughter, masks and feathers, strangers moving shoulder to shoulder through the narrow streets of Lapa. Amid the celebration, the first body was found. It was early morning on February 9th, near the railway tracks of Estaccio Station. A street cleaner discovered a man's torso wrapped in a sequin cape, the kind worn in parade processions. The head and limbs were missing. The sequins were sticky with blood. The newspapers called it O Misterio do Estachio, the mystery of Estachio. Police cordoned off the area, collecting scraps of fabric and a broken carnival mask half buried in the dirt. The coroner determined the man had been dismembered with an extremely sharp blade, possibly a butcher's cleaver. No identification was found. 3 days later, another discovery, a woman's arm floating in the Guanabara Bay, wrapped in blue silk. And then, during Carnival weekend itself, a child stumbled upon a paper box near Cinelandia Square. Inside was a human hand, painted gold. The press began to call him O Cugero do Carnival, the Carnival Butcher. Detective Eduardo Viana, 39, was assigned to the case. He had spent 15 years with the Policia Civil, known for his composure and his distrust of spectacle. He didn't attend Carnival, didn't dance, didn't drink. To him, the city during those days became a mask itself, anonymity disguised as joy. The first task was to identify the victims. The torso found near Estachio was later matched to a missing performer named Jorge Almeida, a tailor who worked on costume for the Unidos de Tijuca Samba School. Almeida had disappeared 2 nights before Carnival. His neighbors recalled a man visiting him that evening, tall, wearing a white coat, speaking softly in a northeastern accent. The second victim, the woman whose arm washed up in the bay, was identified as Lucia Ribeiro, a seamstress who'd also worked on parade outfits. Both victims had connections to the same workshop on Rua Haddock Lobo. Viana visited the building. The owner, an elderly costume maker named Senor Paulo, said that many of his staff had left for the carnival parades. When shown photographs of the crime scene, he shook his head. Monstroso, he muttered. Then he mentioned something odd. A man who had rented the storeroom behind his shop 2 months earlier, paying in cash, no questions asked. He said his name was Miguel. He claimed to be a butcher from Recife, new to the city, looking for a place to store meat for a food stall he planned to open during Carnival. The storeroom was still locked when Viana arrived. Inside, the smell was overwhelming, not of decay, but of disinfectant. The concrete floor was stained dark, the sink rusted red. On a wooden table lay several knives, each sharpened to a fine edge. In the corner was a large brass basin, half filled with water and fragments of sequined fabric. No meat. On the wall hung a cracked mirror and a photograph tacked beside it, a faded portrait of a young woman holding a child. On the back of the photo, a single word written in pencil, Dulce. Fingerprints taken from the knives matched no records. As Carnival drew to a close, fear settled over the city like humidity. Beneath the rhythm of drums and fireworks, a sense of unease threaded through the crowds. Vendors whispered of a man with a butcher's apron seen wandering near the parades, offering free food from a cart that no one ever found again. On the night of February 18th, police received an anonymous call. The voice was male, trembling. He claimed to have seen the Carnival Butcher entering an abandoned warehouse near the port, carrying a large sack. Viana and 2 officers went there before dawn. They found the sack, empty, damp, lying beside a wooden crate. Inside the crate were human remains wrapped in carnival flags. Among them, a head. It was Jorge Almeida. The scalp had been carefully washed, the eyes closed. A painted smile had been drawn across the mouth in red grease paint. Viana stepped back, the sound of waves echoing through the hollow building. He noticed a single footprint near the crate, boot tread, narrow heel, size 42. It led toward the back door and disappeared into the mud. Within hours, the docks were sealed. Ships were searched. Passengers questioned, but no one named Miguel appeared on any passenger lists. Detectives circulated sketches across Rio and neighboring cities. The description varied slightly from witness to witness. Tall, quiet, dark hair, accent from Pernambuco or Bahia. Always polite, always smiling. By March, no new bodies appeared. The story slipped into rumor. Then, in June, hundreds of kilometers north in Recife, local police investigating a fire in an old slaughterhouse found something buried behind the building, a wooden trunk. Inside were human bones, dozens of them cleaned and wrapped in paper labeled with dates from years earlier. some bore-cut marks identical to those found on the carnival victims. Among the debris, they also discovered a blood-stained white coat embroidered with the name Miguel A. Santos. The owner of the slaughterhouse said it had been rented to a man by that name in 1960, who claimed to be a meat supplier. He disappeared the following year. Vienna traveled to Recife personally. He visited the burnt structure, the nearby taverns, the small boarding houses where the man had stayed. In one of them, the keeper remembered him, educado, always with his suitcase, always buying pigs' heads from the market. In a drawer behind the counter, she still kept a piece of paper he'd left behind when he vanished. It was a receipt for butcher's knives, dated December 1961, signed simply, M. Santos. Nothing more. No photograph, no confirmed identity. Some said he had fled to Argentina. Others whispered he'd returned to Rio during Carnival every year, hiding among the massed crowds, feeding his obsession for color, music, and blood. Police never confirmed it. By 1965, the Carnival Butcher had faded into urban legend. Yet the case file remained open. The final page contained a list of unsolved disappearances from the 1950s and 60s. Costume makers, performers, and drifters, all from cities that hosted carnival parades. At the bottom of that list was a note in Vienna's handwriting. Pattern continues. Timing matches carnival schedule. Identity unconfirmed. Possibly same offender traveling annually. In 1978, long after Vienna retired, a janitor cleaning an abandoned warehouse in Rio's Gamboa district discovered a locked iron cabinet. Inside were 6 mannequin torsos dressed in decaying costumes. One wore a butcher's apron streaked brown with age. Pinned to the collar was a yellowed scrap of newspaper. Carnival returns. City dances again. No prints, no trace of the man who placed them there. The cabinet was removed and quietly destroyed. But in certain neighborhoods of Rio, older residents still remember that year. The sound of drums and the strange, heavy silence that came afterward when the parades ended and the city's lights went out. And they say that sometimes during Carnival Week, a figure can be seen moving through the crowds, a tall man in a white coat, smiling beneath the heat, carrying a butcher's sack that sways gently with each step. It began in Moscow's northwestern districts, an area of faded apartment blocks, cold light, and long, empty courtyards that caught the sound of footsteps in winter. Between 2002 and 2006, residents started finding bodies near the rail lines that cut through those neighborhoods. At first, no one noticed the pattern. The city was large, its police overworked, its winters long. Deaths came and went quietly. But the faces, when there were faces left to recognize, had something in common. They were covered. The first was found behind a kiosk near Reknoy Vauxhall. A man in his 50s, local, an electrician. He'd been stabbed repeatedly, but his face had been wrapped in a cheap latex mask, a smiling one, the kind sold at outdoor markets during the New Year festivals. The police treated it as an isolated act of cruelty. They filed it away. A month later, a woman was found 2 districts away, in a small park half buried under snow. She had been beaten, then strangled. The same type of mask covered her face, but this one was different. Painted like a clown, its mouth frozen in an exaggerated grin. A cigarette, but lay beside her, perfectly balanced on the ice. By spring of 2003, there were 4 victims. Each death occurred within walking distance of a metro station. Each was killed at night. The bodies found the next morning by commuters or sanitation workers. No witnesses, no footprints, except those washed away by snow or rain. The tabloids called Maska the mask. At first, the killings drew little national attention. Moscow's crime rate was still high in those years, and the early 2000s were a time of transition. New money, new buildings, but also a strange sense of anonymity. The police followed leads that went nowhere. One detective described the feeling as chasing a shadow through fog. The investigation changed direction after the 5th victim. He was a young man, 23, found near a playground on a quiet residential street. This time, there was something different. The mask wasn't plastic. It was leather, homemade. The stitching ran unevenly across the seams, as if hand-done. Inside, forensic technicians found a faint residue of glue mixed with hair fibers that didn't belong to the victim. A task force was formed under Major Antonov, a veteran investigator known for his patience. He ordered every masked vendor in Moscow questioned. Thousands of records were checked. Imports from China, factory runs, local artisans. Nothing matched. Whoever made them had done it privately. Then, in late 2004, an elderly woman came forward. She ran a small repair shop on the outskirts of the city, near Tichino. She told police that a man had visited her several times between 2002 and 2003, asking her to mend torn gloves and occasionally strange costume pieces. When asked to describe him, she hesitated. She remembered his hands more than his face. They were covered in scars, she said. She showed them the drawer where she kept old orders. Among them was a slip of paper, faded but with the name M. Kalinev. The police ran it through their database and found a partial match. Mikhail Konstantinovich Lunev, age 41, former costume designer for a small theater troupe that had closed in 1999. No criminal record. Lived alone in a Khrushchevka block near the Sokol Metro. When officers arrived at his apartment, no one answered. The neighbors said he was quiet, polite, always carrying fabric rolls. He hadn't been seen for several days. They forced entry. The apartment was clean. Too clean. The kind of sterile order that made the detectives uneasy. In the main room, the wallpaper was stripped to the plaster. On the walls hung masks, dozens of them, arranged in careful rows. Human faces cast in plaster, others made from latex, some painted, some plain. Each bore a number written in pencil beneath it. There were 19 in total. They found no human remains, no blood, but in the corner stood an old trunk. Inside were sketches, pencil drawings of faces labeled only with dates. The earliest was 2002, the most recent 3 weeks before the raid. The media learned of it within hours. The story ran on national television. Moscow masked man, suspect found. But Lunev was nowhere to be found. His passport was missing, and his bank account had been closed months earlier. A single Metro card was left on the kitchen counter, still loaded with credit. Over the next 2 years, the murder stopped. Police believed he'd either fled or taken his own life. The masks were locked away in evidence storage, tagged, and forgotten. Until 2008. That year, a construction crew demolishing a warehouse near Koroshevo discovered a hidden room behind a bricked-over doorway. Inside, they found clothing, bones, and fragments of rubber masks half melted from heat. It looked like someone had tried to burn everything. Among the debris was a metal ID badge, corroded but legible. It read MKL. DNA testing identified the remains as belonging to 2 individuals. One was an unknown male. The other matched the profile of one of the early victims from 2003. The investigators could never explain how that was possible. After the warehouse find, rumors spread. Some claimed that Lunev hadn't worked alone, that the killings were part of something broader. A performance art circle, a clandestine theater group obsessed with identity and death. But the files give no indication of that. What they do mention, briefly, is a single note found at the scene. It was written in neat Cyrillic script on the back of a costume invoice. When they were the face, they stopped being afraid. The handwriting didn't match any known sample from Lunev. The Moscow police closed the case in 2009, citing insufficient evidence. But unofficially, detectives kept a watch on similar incidents. Every few years, a new case appeared. A woman in St. Petersburg, a homeless man in Yaroslavl, each found with a mask over the face. Always different materials, but the same precision. No suspect has ever been confirmed. The photos from the apartment still exist in the archives, filed under Objects 1 to 19. They were never displayed publicly. One officer, years later, described them from memory. They looked almost alive. You'd swear the eyes were following you. In 2017, an anonymous parcel was delivered to a Moscow radio station. Inside was a single latex mask, pale and expressionless, folded carefully in wax paper. No note. The return address was a vacant building that had once housed the old theater troupe where Lunev worked. Police collected it. The file was reopened for 6 months. Nothing came of it. To this day, there's no record of Lunev's body ever being found. No verified sightings, no confession. His apartment block has since been renovated, the walls repainted, the neighbors replaced. But some of the older residents still say that, late at night, they sometimes hear faint footsteps in the hallway, slow, measured, pausing outside certain doors. When they check, there's no one there. Only the sound of someone exhaling softly through something thin and flexible like rubber. Buenos Aires, Argentina, 2003 to 2005. In the early 2000s, summer in Buenos Aires felt endless. Heat rose from the sidewalks, and the air smelled of diesel, sugar, and melting asphalt. Every neighborhood had its familiar sounds: the hum of buses, dogs barking on balconies, and the music of the ice cream trucks that crawled through the streets in the late afternoons. They were called heladeros, men who sold frozen cones and popsicles from brightly colored vans. Children knew them by sound. A simple jingle, cheerful and tinny, echoing between apartment buildings long after the van had passed. In the Palermo district, people began to notice one truck that didn't look quite right. Its paint was faded, the colors duller than the rest. The driver wore a clown costume. Not unusual at first, but strange in the details. The mask was too large, the smile too rigid, the fabric fraying at the edges. He called himself Pipo. Pipo's truck appeared irregularly, sometimes 2 days in a row, sometimes disappearing for weeks. Parents said he drove slowly, often stopping where no children were outside. He didn't play the music as loudly as the others. And when he did, it seemed off-key, like an old cassette warped by heat. The first missing child was a boy named Tomas, 6 years old. He vanished one afternoon in January 2004, near Plaza Serrano. His mother said she'd left him with his older sister for a few minutes while buying bread. When she returned, he was gone. The sister said she'd seen a man in a clown mask waving from an ice cream van. Tomas had walked toward it, and that was the last she saw. The police searched for days. Flyers were printed. Parks and playgrounds were combed. Witnesses described the van: white with blue stripes, a smiling clown painted on the side. But the license plate number the sister remembered didn't exist. A week later, the van reappeared 3 neighborhoods away. A security camera caught it for only a moment, turning down a side street just after midnight. The lights were off. That clip became a fixation for investigators. The image was grainy, the clown's mask barely visible in the driver's seat. But it was enough. Over the next year, 3 more children disappeared. 2 boys and 1 girl, all between 5 and 8 years old. Each case happened near a park or playground. Each had at least one witness who mentioned an ice cream van. The public panic grew slowly, muffled at first. The police avoided naming it a serial case. Parents began walking their children home from school, even in the heat. Then, in December 2004, a patrol officer in the Almagro district reported a van parked behind a supermarket late at night. He approached it, thinking it abandoned. Inside, he found melted ice cream, empty wrappers, and in the back, under a tarp, a clown costume folded neatly beside a set of surgical gloves. The registration traced back to a man named Raul Tizura, 41 years old, a former orderly at a private clinic in San Justo. He had left the job in 2002 after several complaints about inappropriate behavior around pediatric patients. The hospital never filed charges. When police went to his apartment, he wasn't there. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him in weeks. The door was locked from the inside, the windows covered with newspapers. Inside, the apartment smelled of spoiled milk. The walls were lined with photos of children at birthday parties, most torn from magazines or newspapers. On a small table sat a cassette player, the same model used in ice cream vans, and a box of unlabeled tapes. One of the tapes contained nothing but 30 minutes of the ice cream truck jingle, looped over and over, growing slower each time until the notes dissolved into static. The investigation stalled. Tizera had vanished. Interpol issued a notice, but no trace appeared. In February 2005, nearly a year after the first disappearance, a fisherman near the Parana Delta found a small freezer chest washed up on shore. Inside were children's clothes and a red clown nose. Forensics confirmed traces of blood belonging to two of the missing children. That same week, a woman in Rosario reported a man selling ice cream from a truck painted white and blue. She said he wore no mask, but when he smiled, she noticed a faint scar at the corner of his mouth, a cut that pulled his lip upward, making the smile uneven. The local police arrived within hours, but the van was gone. The description matched the one from Buenos Aires exactly. Over the next months, sightings came from across Argentina, Cordoba, Santa Fe, even as far south as Bahia Blanca. The clown's van was seen parked at rest stops, roadside motels, abandoned lots. Always briefly, always gone by the time anyone called. Each time, investigators arrived to find faint tire marks and the same lingering smell, a mix of engine oil and spoiled cream. By mid-2005, the story had become a national obsession. Parents told their children not to approach ice cream trucks at all. Vendors were harassed, their tires slashed. Some stopped working entirely. The police finally traced a lead to a storage facility in La Plata, rented under a false name. Inside were several freezers, unplugged and empty. On the floor, someone had drawn faint chalk outlines, not of bodies, but of rectangles like boxes measured precisely. The only personal item left was a broken clown mask. The edges of its mouth had been cut wider, reshaped into a grin too large for a human face. When forensics examined the mask, they found traces of DNA belonging to 3 of the missing children and Raul Tizera himself. But by then, he was gone. No confirmed sightings were reported after late 2005. The police closed the file in 2008, citing insufficient evidence for further pursuit. Officially, the case remains unsolved. The vans returned to the streets eventually, though fewer now. The jingles sound newer, cleaner. But older residents say they still remember the one that played off-key, drifting through the heat like a lullaby gone wrong. In some neighborhoods, children still whisper about the clown who never took off his mask. They say that on certain nights, when the air is thick and still, you can hear that warped jingle echo faintly between the buildings. Just one van, playing a song no one else remembers. And if you follow the sound too long, it stops before you reach the corner.